My name's Adam Fellows. So just to start off with, I'll just go through my sort of background really, which is, I'm going to cover that in a little bit more detail than I would normally, but that will become clear later. So basically, I was originally from Stockport and in Manchester. That's not me, by the way, that's just a generic baby I found on Google Images. I then did my undergraduate degree in Oxford, studying physiological sciences. It basically means biomedical sciences. They gave it a confusing name for some reason. Just as a side note, my A-levels were chemistry, biology, and maths. So quite sort of straightforward, but it wasn't really obvious for me to choose a degree. It was almost by a process of elimination, really. I quite liked the body. I quite liked sport. I quite liked studying. I quite liked knowing how the body works. I didn't really like the idea of studying plants or medicine. So I was left with this really. I ended up enjoying it. I ended up enjoying it so much that I ended up doing a master's and a PhD in cardiovascular medicine. So this was actually looking at some of the mechanisms involved in heart attacks after you get this build-up of fatty deposits in your coronary arteries. And I enjoyed my master's and PhD so much that I've carried on as well. So yeah, I'm now doing what's called a postdoc or a research scientist position. My first one was at King's College London back in 2018, and then just before the pandemic, I joined Imperial College London for my second postdoc job. So I think I'm basically in between. I'm less senior than Paul, who is a lecturer, and I'm also less senior than Helen, who is a senior research associate. I'm sort of a junior research associate, really. So I'm above a PhD, but I'm relatively inexperienced. And there's lots of different ways to call what we do for a living. I'm a researcher. I'm a biomedical scientist, an academic scientist. If people ask, I say I'm a scientist, but I work at a university rather than for the NHS or for a pharmaceutical company or something like that. Now, the previous two speakers covered this very, very well in terms of kind of day-to-day roles. So thankfully mine's quite brief, but they covered it really well. So the bulk of my time is laboratory research. So I'm one of the people in the white coats with the pipettes doing the experiments. For most of my time, I've worked with cells in dishes. So we grow them up, we have them in big bottles, we fill them with liquid. We give them various drugs and we analyze them in various ways. But that's where I spend most of my time. It's very hands-on, but at the same time, in order to do good science, it requires a lot of planning. So as we mentioned before, lots of reading of the current literature, what's already known, finding out about the background behind these techniques, and what's the best way to perform this experiment. So some people are better at this than others. For me, this is quite a challenging thing, so I tend to need to take a lot of time planning. But then also, yeah, the actual physical experiments also take quite a lot of time as well. And yeah, I'm not quite at the stage where I'm having lots of meetings. So basically, a lot of my time is in the lab. I do still have to give presentations, so people want to know the work I'm doing. So I have to do it at conferences or kind of internal meetings or kind of just to people within our lab or in our department. I have to supervise relatively often. We have other people in the lab who are more junior than me, such as PhD students or master students or even undergraduates. So they need to be shown various things. We might kind of help them with their projects, which obviously, which is something I enjoy, but yeah, it can take up a reasonable amount of your time. Applications, I think, as the previous two speakers mentioned, it's a relatively unstable job. Most of the contracts are short. You always need, even when you get to a senior level, you always need to be applying for more money and more funding and more positions. So yeah, it's something that you can't really settle when you're in this position. You always need to be thinking about the next step, because it's all done in. If you're very lucky, you might get a 5-year position, but normally it's 2 to 3 years. And teaching, occasionally you have to do some teaching, but also as previously mentioned, lots of publications to write. So yeah, just I think this has been covered before, but just so this is kind of what it's like on the academic pathway, which I've ended up taking, which was not planned from the beginning. It was all done kind of one step at a time. But you can see all the way down here from GCSEs, all the way up to kind of professors and sort of heads of universities. But this little bit where I am in the middle, and as was Helen, the previous speaker, it's not even shown on this diagram, but we're right there in this middle part here, in between a PhD and a lecturer. And in medicine, you do get quite a lot of people in this position, but it's worth bearing in mind that in other academic disciplines, that there's actually very few of us. It tends to go straight from PhD into lecturer. But in medicine, this is a big bottleneck. It's very, very competitive to get to that next stage where you end up having a much more stable position. So that's the stage which I'm trying to get to now, to that lecturer stage. Yeah, I think I'd just like to emphasize why I became a scientist, really. As I said, it was not something that I'd wanted to do for a long time. It was very, very gradual. I learned in stages, and I realized that I liked it more and more. The huge things for me are the fact that you can pursue what interests you, and you can use that knowledge and that data to make discoveries. It can be discoveries about the human body. It can be new treatments for diseases. And for me, it gives me a huge amount of satisfaction, but also the kind of the freedom and the flexibility to do mainly what I want, obviously within limits. Other reasons, more practical reasons, the pay is relatively good. As was said before, it does take a lot of training. You can still be paid during your PhD, and if you decide to take that through into the postdoc, it is relatively well paid. The downside is that you can work a lot of hours, but they can also be flexible. It depends on your boss to an extent, but they are normally they normally don't mind exactly when you work. It's not normally a straightforward 9 to 5. And as we said before, it's really varied. It's never boring. No 2 days are the same. It really is an exciting career to have. And so on that note, I also found it difficult to come up with a case study, because it's a very making discoveries is very gradual, and often it's quite also I would have found it very hard to explain without it being very technical and sounding quite boring. So my case study is actually kind of how I decided to do what I do, which was quite a long time. So as I mentioned in my background, it was 7 years of being a student. Basically, it was an undergrad, it was a master's and a PhD, and I always wanted to go to university, mainly because I wanted a job that I would enjoy, and I thought university was a great way to do that, because I knew that I quite liked studying, I quite liked learning, and so university was a good option. As I said, choosing exactly what to do was not particularly straightforward. But when I got there, one of the things that I wanted to do is that I immediately found that there was actually lots of things available to me that I wouldn't have thought existed. Things like career services, things like how helpful, how much your supervisor knows, how much other people know, and so that was one of the things that that really helped me kind of and also I didn't come from an academic background, or I didn't know many people who went to university, so it was really helpful just to know everything that was available. So just taking it all in, basically taking everything in that you can. Yeah, as I said, I didn't have anything in mind, so I thought about jobs that I'd never even thought of. I thought for a while I might want to do journalism, or for a while I thought I might want to do pharmaceuticals. And I think the good thing is that you don't really know if you'd like it unless you've thought of it. It's difficult to give it a go, but you can think about it. If you thought you might like it, you can do an internship, or you can do smaller kind of shadowing experiences, things like that. And I think that's something that university is really useful for. I think a really crucial thing is that it's very easy to kind of, especially if you've got like a supervisor or a mentor, it's quite easy to only see their view or their vision. What I find really helpful is asking asking the same questions but to different people, because two people can have a very different view on things, and one of which you might agree with, one of which you might agree with, but chances are it's probably somewhere in the middle. But so like I think one thing that I've learned is that, unfortunately, as in all careers, you don't always have a good boss or a good supervisor or a good mentor. So it's good to get a broad range of opinions before you end up going down a path that might not be for you. Another simple, this sounds very, very simple, but even in my experience, it's something that's not done enough. I think I often experience, I get questions from people, or I hear of things where you really could have been able to Google it. The internet is an incredible resource. Not just things like forums, but people have prepared documents, people have got advice and guidance to things that you wouldn't have thought they would, but the amount of resources available is quite incredible. Some of the skills which I think have been most important along my journey, persistence is huge. I think you really do have to keep trying. I think unfortunately things aren't going to get given to you on a plate. You really do have to keep trying, and even if you get knocked back, you need to keep going. You do need to be patient as well. I think having a bit of patience and belief in yourself is huge. To know that this is the right thing for you to do. So, for example, after my first year at university, I realized that I wanted to do an internship in a lab, and I think most people I know didn't really know that much about what options were available. It wasn't really a thing that was done very often, but I was quite determined, and I basically spent days and days and days looking on the internet for all the kind of things that would be available, and I think I applied for 4 or 5 different opportunities, and I got rejected from all of them. And so that was very difficult, but I still had a bit of time. I ended up applying for a few more just about in time, and I ended up getting an offer right at the last minute because someone else pulled out. And I think that wouldn't have happened unless I'd applied to so many and unless I'd kept going enough to try, because it was something that I really wanted to do. The things that I learned over that time, yeah, as I said, kind of having different options. It's I think, at least for me anyway, something that's worked quite well is not necessarily having a very linear approach, and not necessarily like you have an idea of what you want, but there's different ways to get from A to B. I think that's really important. So something which has been quite personal for me is that kind of I have done a lot of planning. So like when I know what I want to do, I will try and put the effort in. But for me, it's always been quite my plans are always quite short term, and that's actually worked quite well. I think a lot of times people can think that you need to be planning a long time in advance. You need to know what you want to be doing in 5, 10, 15, 20 years. That's something that's never really appealed to me. So I just took it one step at a time, and when I know what that next step is, I'll go for it. But until then, I'm not worried about 2 steps beyond. And I think for, at least for me, that has worked quite well. And another thing, I know this is not necessarily something that I should be saying or that people want to hear, but kind of the grades are only one piece of the puzzle. I think there's lots and lots of extra skills which I think are equally important, if not more important, than having the ability to memorize things or retain information or perform well in an exam. I think that's because I've never had that has worked quite well. And another thing, I know this is not necessarily something that I should be saying or that people want to hear, but kind of the grades are only one piece of the puzzle. I think there's lots and lots of extra skills which I think are equally important, if not more important, than having the ability to memorize things or retain information or perform well in an exam. I think that's because I've never been kind of top of the class. I've never had the best grades, but I think being quite determined about what I want to do has been the most important thing. And I think that's given me extra skills apart from study. Thank you very much. That's everything